I've always played Kingdom Come Deliverance on PC using a joystick. Ever since the first game, this has been my go-to control scheme, which works just fine. However, from time to time, there would be comments in our KCD-related videos stating that the standard keyboard and mouse is much better for it. Therefore, out of curiosity, I spent about a week playing both titles, with an intention of finding out the differences regarding input experience. And for this video, I'll share with you everything I observed, so you'll be aware of the pointers which make one device type more preferable over the other. Let's begin. Before we get into the details, let's first address an obvious fact, that when it comes to general aiming in KCD, a mouse is always going to be faster and more accurate, simply because we're using our entire hand on a bigger space, in comparison to just the rotational movement of our thumb on a much smaller area via the analog stick. And there's no native support for gyro aiming as well. Hence, anything that has something to do with repositioning Henry's field of view is smoother using a mouse. However, many of the actions we can do within this IP doesn't really demand lightning-fast pointing precision, which I think is the reason why using a controller is fine. Even if we spend a split second longer trying to grab a file when brewing concoctions, or every time we fiddle around for a bit aiming the crosshair at a moving NPC's pouch during pickpocketing, the action isn't affected too much. Moreover, some interaction functions in both games don't even utilize the mouse, such as when we choose among dialogue options during conversations, or while playing Farkle, which places both control devices on equal footing. With that said, there are some distinct advantages to a mouse. The most obvious among them is for when using ranged weapons, although by how much depends on the scenario. When shooting at a single target multiple times during archery range contests, it's most likely that using a controller is adequate, because aim calibrations are minimal once we figure out where shots should be coming from, and is really more about knowing when to release the projectile. Meanwhile, Popinjay, which sees us downing multiple targets at different distances and heights, shifts our focus to making adjustments for every single one of them. So a mouse has a speed and accuracy advantage, but because we're dealing with stationary objects here, a controller should also work well.
Oh, I'm not hitting a thing.
Surprisingly, at least in my case, this same observation also carries over to mounted shooting competitions. Even if our character is on the move, the strategy for bows and crossbows are the same. We aim our weapon towards the left when an intended target is still a bit further away, then shoot it as we pass by. Since there's ample time to prepare each shot, I never had any problem using a controller. Because just like with archery range contests, this kind of activity is more about timing our release. The same thing goes when competing in chumps. Both a generous preparation time and anticipated shots are present here. The only difference is that it's the logs which are moving instead of Henry. Now, while the basic idea behind mounted shooting is relatively simple, there's also a gap between the two control types in KCD1, which coincidentally also affects attacking with a melee weapon. One requirement for both is that we must hold down an input so our horse would continuously trot. With a controller, the 3 o'clock button should be pressed using the index, so our thumb can freely rotate the right analog stick, then use our ring finger for squeezing the right trigger. This is a configuration that should work regardless of hand size, but it's not a comfortable grip. When compared to the KBM, which assigns trotting to shift, it's not even close, since it's essentially a standard layout used by most games. Thankfully, in KCD2, this button has been relocated to L3, and holding it down is no longer required, so controller users can focus more on timing strikes or aiming their ranged weapon. Sniping hostiles, of course, is more challenging overall, because there are some additional variables we must take into account. And while it's possible to apply the same technique we use for mounted shooting contests here, I noticed that a mouse will also allow us to easily track targets as we ride past them, which might improve our hit rate. So this is one scenario where I would definitely choose KBM first. Even so, its effectiveness is somewhat limited, since fighting enemies on horseback when some of them are shooting at Henry is very dangerous, especially crossbow users who have insane accuracy. As for dealing with them on foot, using a controller is not too difficult, simply because they charge our character head-on in both games. Though getting familiar with a projectile's flight path is an entirely different matter. It does become more forgiving once we start applying poisons to our arrows and bolts that can slow them down, or when attacking from stealth. There's no sense of urgency, which makes it okay even if aiming is slightly slower. There's an exception in KCD2 though, because one interesting change to enemy behavior is that shield carriers will now actually use them as cover if they're being shot at, so quickly landing crucial head hits should be easier with a mouse. In a previous video that covered several gameplay elements I wish were known from the beginning in KCD2, there was one portion where I mentioned the importance of always keeping a melee weapon on standby, because switching to others with a controller has to be done through its contextual menu. With keyboards, however, which obviously has a lot more switches available for assignment, we can easily grab any of the weapons equipped on our belt without much fuss. So it's less likely for accidental wielding of a wrong one to happen during combat. The same thing goes with potions assigned to Henry's pouch. Instead of pressing right on the D-pad and selecting what's needed before holding down the 6 o'clock button, we can do a similar action in one move by holding down 5, 6, 7, or 8. Additionally, since the character menu has a cursor function, it's quite nice that we can quickly click on whichever is needed as opposed to going through each one. When checking out specifics and their corresponding details, the speed difference doesn't seem that much. That is until we start getting into inventory management. This is just an assumption, but I suspect a lot of KCD players like to collect every kind of equipment there is to give Henry the most options fashion-wise. The problem is, going through our item box's contents is a slow process with the controller, because all objects are arranged in a single column, where the selector must go through each one, and there's no way to speed it up. The only filters available are for weapons and armor. But these two are still very extensive lists, especially the latter, where every type of clothing, defensive gear, jewelry, and even horse tack share the same tab. All items here are split up into sections which cannot be rearranged. Hence, if for example we want to change Henry's hat, or maybe pick a different colored pair of shoes, those things can be accessed fairly quickly. But everything else is sandwiched in between. So if we need to grab a coat, or perhaps a nice pair of gloves, we have to go through every item in possession, occupying other slots first. Alternatively, we can list items in alphabetical order per tab, but this doesn't solve our slow access to those ones situated in the middle, aside from having to memorize exact names of what we're searching for. Furthermore, since there's no equipment preview, it's most likely that we'll have to rifle through our item box multiple times when assembling a desired look. This is not an issue with KBM at all, largely thanks to the available scroll bar. I'm not sure if it's possible to create a patch that would allow us to select this gizmo and use it via the right analog stick or something similar, but I sure hope this aspect of the character menu using a controller gets improved, because it really is quite slow, which becomes more evident as our collection grows. During the course of my research comparing these two control devices, there were also a couple of peculiar annotations made, such as the combat bug I mentioned in a previous video, where controller users must press the attack button once after drawing their weapon before Henry actually does something. And it's a behavior that's observable in both KCD games. Initially, I assumed it only affected the PC version, But recently, I've also been reading comments from console players who are facing the same issue. Meanwhile, in KCD1, mounting and dismounting a horse is assigned to the same button, which is a common practice in most video games if a ride is available. But in KCD2, these two actions have been split up, and I don't see any good reason for it. As a result, there's a chance that ever so often, players might press the inspect horse button instead when trying to mount up. Apart from that, there's also something odd going on when Henry's sharpening weapons using a grindstone. In KCD1, tilting the right analog stick forward or moving the mouse up will raise our blade and vice versa, which I think is very intuitive. This has been carried over into the second game, but only for joysticks, because the edge alignment controls is inverted when using a mouse, which might be confusing at first. On the other hand, when it comes to blacksmithing, I think KBM has a slight advantage in terms of hammering speed, because initially, the way it's done involves making a slight adjustment first before swinging, and once we get used to its cycle, these two actions can be overlapped to speed things up. With swords, this can easily be done even with a controller, because we're just nudging the metal forward and back. But when it comes to axes and horseshoes, where the hammer must be moved in 4 directions, I found that making incremental adjustments to our aim more accurate with the mouse. In relation to this, there's also a surprising change to KBM when it comes to lockpicking. As I've mentioned at the beginning, a mouse by design has an upper hand in terms of precision, so when viewers leave a comment stating it's better for bypassing locks, I have no doubt that such a remark is true, and when I tested it myself in KCD1, the result is exactly what's expected. In the second game though, an additional advantage has been included to a mouse, because if we compare our cursor between the two games, you'll notice that it's dampened in KCD2, meaning it moves about at a much smaller rate relative to the mouse, which makes our actions more precise. If you've already seen the video about thievery, which focused on using a controller, you'll realize just how relevant this alteration is, so lockpicking is indeed easier with a KBM. When it comes to melee combat, in my experience, I've found the two control devices to be on equal footing for the most part. But there is an issue we need to be aware of and how it can be resolved. Every time Henry gets into a fight, a target lock automatically engages so we can get started ASAP. However, there's a potential problem when using KBM, because if we swing the mouse left or right too much when changing attack directions, it's most likely that the automatic lock-on will be deactivated. So when using a mouse in such mode, it's required that we only make small horizontal movements. This doesn't easily happen with a controller, since every time we tilt the right analog stick, there's a definite stopping point which signals us when to let go. The only time something similar would occur is if we turn the stick in a direction where our character's weapon is already being held. So if, for example, he has it on the left side, tilting the stick there will make Henry stop focusing. I've confirmed that such combat behavior is present in both games, and it goes without saying why accidentally turning our back on an enemy is not a good thing. Of course, these guidelines for both input devices are things we can get used to over time. But if you suspect that it will be troublesome in your playthrough, a simple solution is to activate the manual target lock by pressing R3 on a controller or Tab on a keyboard. When this is in use, as represented by a yellow ring, the issues I mentioned just now will no longer happen. And coincidentally, it's also utilized for cycling between enemies. The only thing we need to take note of is that the button assigned for sprinting in both games, Shift on a keyboard or 3 o'clock button via a controller in KCD1, and L3 on the second will deactivate the lock-on. In addition, for KCD2, pressing R1 or the middle mouse button will have a similar effect. KBM users specifically will benefit from this, I think, because I've read comments from such players who are having a hard time pulling off combination strikes. In my tests, I noticed that they're easier to do if we exaggerate our mouse movements, and the automated targeting doesn't stop while doing so. But it would still be best if we utilize the manual lock, so we'll have one less thing to worry about while fighting. In summary, using a controller for KCD 1 and 2 is not too far behind in most cases. With exception to extensive item box management, lockpicking, and shooting at live targets from horseback, a joystick does suffice. But from what I can tell, a keyboard and mouse will provide a better gaming experience overall.
Yeah! 1, 2, 3.